Welcome back into the Blacksburg Buzz. Today we're breaking down a kind of funky Marshall game. Now the Hokies end up winning 31 to 14, and both teams are now 1-1 on the season. Before we go into some notable players for Virginia Tech, let's talk about today's video sponsor, Bet Online. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of 200K. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here. So there were a few Tech players that I thought really stood out, and the biggest one by far was Bashal Tootin, and I don't think there's really any surprise there. 22 carries for 120 yards and also one touchdown, went along with his 4 receptions for 7 yards. So a pretty solid day overall for Bashal Tootin, and that's what he's really done ever since he started breaking out last year. He had 5.5 yards per carry in this game against Marshall, and he was good the whole time. We're just waiting for this offense to finally start running the ball and just pulling themselves together. In the second half, they decided, let's finally give him the chance. I don't know why exactly it took so long, but the second that Virginia Tech gave Bashal Tootin the ball, things just started to work themselves out. There was a sequence where he really started heating up. He had 5 straight touches, picked up about 4-ish yards per carry. And I was thinking to myself up in the press box, why haven't we done this all game? Why wasn't Virginia Tech doing that the entire time? Bashal Tootin is one of the foundational pieces of this offense, and it seems like there are far too many drives where he's not getting a touch or he's getting a designed run right up the middle, which just hasn't been working for Virginia Tech. They don't have the O line at the moment to really cater towards some runs up the middle. Just the blocking isn't there. They're not creating gaps for the backs to run through. And Tootin's great at going around the edge. So I don't really understand why Virginia Tech waits so long to get him the ball, because when they do, the offense just catches fire. Now, the next guy was Malachi Thomas. He obviously didn't get nearly as many touches as Tootin, but he was pretty solid. 52 yards on his 9 rushes. Obviously, Tootin's going to be your main guy, but I like the mix between the two backs. It gives you 2 different looks, and I think they've both been pretty solid so far in their time at Tech. If you go to Tootin on the regular and you mix in Malachi Thomas every once in a while, then it really works for this team. So Thomas was having a good day when they mixed him in as well, and I liked what I saw out of him. Moving over to the receivers, Jalen Lane was easily the most consistent, the biggest playmaker of this game. His special teams was incredible. He had a great performance on the special teams end as well. A 58-yard punt return to the house for the Hokies' first touchdown. And he also had an 18-yard return that picked up some pretty solid yardage for the team. Put them in a really good spot to begin their drive and gave Tech a pretty good opportunity there. It really seemed like Jalen Lane was the only guy who was producing right from the start of the game. He got Tech that first score on the punt return, and he gave him a glimmer of offense early on. He was so important in this game. I don't know if Tech wins this game without Jalen Lane. I really don't. He just had such a big game. He was one of the main receivers that was getting open and actually making plays. It felt like some of the guys that you wanted to look for, you didn't really see. I don't think Allie Jennings even had a catch in this game, and he's supposed to be the clear-cut wide receiver 1. I don't know how you can have a clear-cut wide receiver one and not get him the ball at all over the course of a game. But Jalen Lane was looking good. He was making plays, he was picking up yards, and he was getting in the end zone. So you can't really ask for much more out of one of your receivers. And then, like I said, being so great on the special teams, it made a huge difference as well. It ignited that offense. It gave Tech something, some sort of positive going into the locker room at halftime, and there wasn't much of that during the first half of this game. It was a lot like the Vanderbilt game, a super slow start in the first two quarters. And then you started getting something going in the third and the fourth quarter, just ran away with it. But you can't do that against every team. You might be able to pull it off against Marshall, and if you'd started maybe in the second quarter, I think you could win that Vanderbilt game. But you can't do that against Rutgers. You can't do that against Miami. You got to play all four quarters, all 60 minutes, or you're not going to come out with a win. Now, the last guy that really stood out to me was Steven Gosnell, a career long reception of 49 yards. He only had one other catch during the game for 5 yards, but that big play from him was electric. The crowd was hype, the team was hype, and it came in such a big moment during the game. Virginia Tech was ahead just a little bit, but Marshall blew right up the field and scored in two plays. They had a monster run that broke away for about 60 yards. And then they put it in on the next play. And, on the subsequent drive, that deep shot to Gosnell that he comes up with, that was huge. It got Tech right back into the red zone in one throw. And it was the answer for what Marshall had. They started working themselves back into the game, and Gosnell comes up with a big play to get Tech right back there on the verge of scoring. It was huge in terms of just the way the game progressed and not letting Marshall work back into the game, because they were getting pretty close at that point, and it was less than a one touchdown game. So with Gosnell getting the Hokies right up there on the verge of scoring, it really helped to start putting the game away and getting to that point where Marshall really didn't have enough time to make that comeback. So going back to that slow start, a lot like last weekend, the Hokies just didn't really have much happening at all in the first half. They didn't pass 100 yards until well into the second quarter. 100 yards of total offense. Not just passing, not just rushing, 100 yards of total offense. So it's very concerning when you're not putting up great numbers, you're not putting on a good show for the home crowd in the home opener against a group of five school that you're looking to beat pretty handily. Now, the final score, not too bad for Virginia Tech, a pretty solid win there. But still, you need more than that. They were pretty big favorites in this game, and on the scoreboard, they pulled it off. They were pretty big favorites, and they got that big win. But if you're there watching the game and seeing it develop, you can still see that Virginia Tech isn't what people thought they were going to be during the offseason. This isn't that powerhouse team, at least not yet. They have got to play a full four-quarter game before you can have much confidence in them for winning any really big matchup. I think there's going to be some tough games in the ACC, and until they prove otherwise, I'm a bit concerned about them, honestly. They had a couple good drives through the third quarter and in the second quarter as well, but that first really solid drive in the second quarter, an illegal block in the back on Quan Felton, it killed all the momentum for the team. It called back the touchdown, and the team wasn't able to get the first down, and they had to settle for a field goal. That was a heartbreaking play for the Hokies, and it really sums up what their first halves have looked like. It just hasn't been good, and when they do get something going, there's always something that goes wrong that really hurts that one drive where they really start putting it together. You really needed that touchdown to hopefully spark the offense a little bit. Lane had had the punt return already, but it had been a while since they've struck with a pretty decent drive. They were punting throughout the entirety of the first half. They just couldn't really put it in. And that really kills it. The illegal block in the back, it takes away all that momentum. They had the touchdown, they got it into the end zone, but the penalty pulls it back and you have to settle for a field goal. That really hurts the vibe on the bench. Now, out of the half, they did give it to Tootin over and over and over again for small to medium gains, and he kept things moving. That's what the Hokies need to start doing earlier in the game. He's one of the consistent players so far for Virginia Tech. He wasn't as good against Vanderbilt, but you know you can rely on Bashal Tutin, and you have to go to him over and over again. Until this passing attack for Virginia Tech can really get things figured out, you need to use the run game. Use it and abuse it until the defense shows you otherwise. Bashal Tutin wasn't really getting stopped much at all by Marshall. So I love the way that Virginia Tech eventually figured out just give it to Tutin. He'll give you 4 yards. You can pass it every once in a while, but when you've got a guy who's going to get you halfway to the chains, you got to use him and use him as much as you can. There's no point in saving it all for the second half. Get the offense moving in the first quarter, get them moving in the second quarter, and some put some points up on the board. Now, it's so concerning to see an offense that can dominate these games fail to show up and fail to show up twice now. They've been there for the second half, but I'm not certain that a prolific second half can beat a Rutgers team in a couple weeks, let alone beat Miami, who looks like an absolute powerhouse in the ACC. I don't think you can play 2 good quarters and beat Rutgers. I just don't think you can do it. And coming out of conference play 2-2, optimistically, that's pretty bad. Virginia Tech ahead of the season was looking at hopefully 4-0 coming out of conference play, moving into the ACC, and then you've got that tough Miami game. But if you lose 2 of those, pretty concerning for the postseason hopes of the Hokies. Now, the second halves do give me a little bit of confidence in the team, but like I said, at the end of the day, you need 60 minutes of quality football to really beat any decent team, and Virginia Tech has not done that. They haven't been able to put this passing attack together really at all. You've seen a couple of big plays, but working a lot behind the line of scrimmage, a lot of short, quick passes. There's not enough time to throw up the field. There's a great group of receivers, but if you don't get them the ball, they can't do anything. And that's something that's really hurt Virginia Tech so far this season. You looked at this group during the offseason and thought, okay, at the very worst, they're probably a top 3 receiving core within the ACC at the worst. You expected Drones to take a step up, and at this point, he hasn't really shown that. Now, it did seem like maybe he was a little banged up after that Vanderbilt game where he started cramping late in the game. He had to come out for a couple of those overtime plays as well. So maybe he's still recovering from that. But at the same time, just his passing hasn't been on point. He hasn't really been finding those receivers. And they can't do anything if you don't get them the ball. So if you're not going to get the receivers the ball, then at that point, you've got to give it to Tootin. And he's been performing when he does get the ball, but it's so many constant looks behind the line of scrimmage, the short passes that don't have much of an opportunity to pick up some good yards that's been hurting Tech. Drones isn't scrambling like we saw him last year, which is probably due to being potentially banged up. But you've got to figure some things out. The O-line is a mess. The passing attack is a mess. Now, luckily in this Marshall game, the defense did show up, unlike at Vanderbilt. They were able to stop some passes, breaking up a lot of stuff. There was a tipped pass that Delane was able to intercept. That was a big play there, right along the sidelines in front of the bench. But you can't just rely on the defense. You need all the aspects of this team to pull things together, and they need to have them all together at the same time, which we haven't seen so far. So at the end of the day, just a lot of stuff to figure out. If Tech can play like the second half for a full 4 quarters, then they might be a pretty decent team as we expected during the offseason. But until they do that and do that consistently, I'm going to be a little bit concerned about a lot of these games coming up. Make sure you stay tuned for some upcoming episodes as we're going to continue with that scheduled deep dive heading into part 3 in games 5 and 6. And we've got another game coming up against Old Dominion in Norfolk. So a little bit concerned about that after the last time the Hokies went on the road against ODU. And we'll be looking over that game, seeing what the big storylines are and who the players you need to watch are. So make sure you stay tuned for some more episodes this week.